Our story begins with the death of international crime boss Liam McCaffrey, who dies behind bars in prison. Now, McCaffrey's son, an ex-elite assassin named Dan, the very man who turned McCaffrey in, tells his wife Jessica to go into a room to secure a package. Jessica makes her way to the room, carefully avoiding the cameras. In front of her, inside the package, is an expensive-looking necklace. Dan enters the room from behind. He puts the gift around Jessica's neck. But just then, their son Kyle calls them. Their youngest son Max had thrown up all over the house. This means Jessica and Dan will have to leave their date and head home. Dan has left his assassin life behind, a life his family knows all about, and now runs a security company. They all arrive to celebrate Thanksgiving with Jessica's family. Their daughter Nina is studying journalism in London. Everyone talks to her over video call. Jessica's dad mentions, "I heard that awful man you wrote the article about died in prison last week." This man is none other than Nina's grandfather. Jessica apologizes to Dan on behalf of her father. Later, in private, Jessica tells Nina that she's been offered the position of head of women's track at Ohio State. But Jessica hasn't discussed this with Dan yet because they would have to move to Ohio for it, which isn't part of their family plans. Jessica changes the subject and asks Nina when she's coming back for Christmas. But Nina isn't coming back because her classes start just a few days after Christmas. This news doesn't sit well with Dan at all. He wanted the whole family to be together for Christmas. So the very next day, Dan goes to his office to look into international offers. He's received an offer from a bank in London. They want him to do a security check. This means Dan can take his entire family to see Nina in London under the guise of a business expense. Now, neither Jessica nor Kyle are thrilled about this plan. But Dan tries to convince them that they have to spend Christmas together. Soon enough, Jessica agrees, saying a home isn't defined by a house or a city. Wherever we're together, that's home. And just then, Kyle has a little accident. He also says, "All right, let's just go to London." So they all arrive in London. And Dan takes his family straight to Nina's place instead of the hotel. While using the bathroom, Kyle spots a guy in the shower. Dan immediately grabs hold of this guy. Nina steps in and explains that this is her boyfriend, Omar. Jessica is quite taken with Omar's French accent. But Dan doesn't like this one bit. Omar is a chef, he does parkour, and he keeps calling Dan daddy. Later, while walking around, Omar shows them some parkour moves. Max is so impressed that he tries to do it himself, which causes him to fall flat on his face. The next day, Dan heads out to do his job at the bank. Nina asks Jessica why she still hasn't told Dad about the job offer. Nina is taking the boys to the park. She tells her mom to rest easy because she's going to have to tell Dad. Dan arrives at the bank. As soon as he gets there, he starts checking out the security. Dan meets a man named Aiden Clark. They've brought Dan here for his premium services. Dan has to expose the weaknesses in their security by breaking in. Dan has already scanned and cloned an employee's keycard. He opens the first door. Clark wants Dan to break into the safe deposit room. Dan opens the next door with an old-fashioned paperclip. After that, an employee tells him, "You can't be back there." But Dan reads the name on his ID and confidently tells him to leave. After that, there's a reinforced steel door ahead of them. But Dan has stolen that employee's card for this. However, as soon as Dan enters the safe deposit room, he grabs Aiden and says, "That employee didn't recognize you. Tell me who you are. You're no bank manager." Aiden shows Dan a photo of his wife on his phone. They had kidnapped her just a little while ago. They want Dan to open a specific deposit box. Inside this box is a key with the initial M on it. Dan recognizes it. It's the key to the kingdom. Aiden shows Dan a photo from his childhood. In it is a young boy Dan knew as Finn, the maid's kid. This man, Aiden, is Finn, who is actually Dan's younger brother. And now Finn is going to take this digital key and pin the blame for all of this on Dan. Finn could have done all this alone, but he wanted to frame Dan. At Finn's command, Dan takes him out of the bank at gunpoint. Outside, Jessica steps out of the car that came to pick up Finn. A gun is taped to Jessica's hand. The police are now after them. Dan takes Jessica and ducks into a cafe. He steals a woman's bag to hide Jessica's gun. And just then, on the other side, Finn realizes the key is missing from his box, which means Dan stole it. Meanwhile, the rest of Dan's family is sitting in a park. Kyle gets a call from Dan saying, "Get rid of your phones." But Kyle doesn't understand what he means. Dan explains everything to Nina. Nina throws Kyle's phone into a trash can. Dan does the same with Jessica's phone. He starts running with his entire family. Finn is after them in his car. They all get on a London tour bus. Everyone's asking who this man is. Finn shows up and says, "Tell them, Dan. Tell them how Dad left me on a barren rock and gave you everything you ever wanted, and you threw it away." Finn demands the key from Dan. But Dan snatches Finn's gun and throws it out of the bus. The two of them start fighting on the upper deck of the bus. Finn starts to overpower Dan. Jessica comes up to help Dan. But Finn grabs Jessica. So Dan throws the key off the bus. Finn goes after the key. Dan takes his family to a restaurant. A man there hands Dan a bag. Dan had helped this man before. Inside the bag is a phone and a lot of cash. Dan tells everyone that they had a house in Ireland where they used to go in the summer. And the housekeeper there had a son, Finn. And he just found out that Finn's father is his own dad. Now they need to get out of London. But Nina can't leave. She has an entire life here now. Dan says that with that key, Finn has access to his father's encrypted server. That means all of his money, all of his assassins, all of his surveillance capabilities. There's nowhere to hide. And they can't go to the police because Finn made it look like Dan robbed a bank. And now Finn has all the details of Dan's past assassin work. Finn takes the key and arrives in Paris. His dad's butler, Vikram, is there. Finn says, "I have come home to take over the family business." Finn shows Vikram the key. Vikram has to follow Finn's orders. Finn goes inside the house and inserts the key into his father's desk. As soon as he does, a bunch of screens appear in front of him. He now has limitless money and intel. Dan listens to his kids and stops running from his past. He heads straight to Paris. He says, "I am gonna end this once and for all." They all get inside a truck and enter Paris. Everyone is hungry. So Dan takes them to a friend of his, Svetlana. Svetlana is Dan's ex, which Jessica is obviously not happy about. Svetlana is thrilled to see Dan. She gives them shelter. Jessica's photos have already made it into the newspapers. She's getting jealous watching Svetlana and Dan talk. Max finishes his entire meal for the first time. Jessica can't believe it. Dan tells Jessica that Finn has agreed to meet. Dan doesn't want to treat Finn like a thug. He is his blood and he was a good kid back then. Their dad made him this way. Dan and Finn meet at a museum. Finn says, "When I was 12, I waited outside your mansion in the freezing rain for hours, just to catch a glimpse of the life you had. I wanted to run after you, yell at you both that I am your blood. But my legs were numb from the cold." Dan says he's left that life behind. Finn replies, "Is that supposed to make me feel better, that you didn't even want what you were given?" Finn calls Dan, "Daddy's little prince." Dan slaps him. Dan says, "If I'd have known you were my brother, I'd have been a brother to you from the very beginning." Dan tells him he called him here to say it's not too late. You end this right now and we could still be brothers. But Finn doesn't like the idea of giving up their dad's entire empire just to become Dan's brother. Dan says, "Fine, take all of Dad's money. But don't become Dad." But Finn doesn't take any of Dan's advice. "I am taking what's mine. I am not waiting outside in the cold any longer." Dan says, "Call this all off, or I will show you who Dad trained me to be." He tells Finn clearly that if he comes near his family, "I am gonna tear you apart." Finn calls a bunch of assassins and sends them after Dan. Whoever stops him gets triple their rate. When Jessica sees Dan getting guns from Svetlana, she understands his meeting with Finn didn't go well. Their kid's mood isn't good either. This isn't the Christmas they envisioned. To cheer them up, Dan takes them on a boat ride. When they come back, everyone goes to sleep. Dan is worried about everyone and can't sleep. That's when Svetlana comes and starts drinking with him. Dan starts talking to Svetlana about his family and how much he loves them. Hearing all this, Svetlana realizes her mistake. The truth is, Finn had put a bounty on Dan's name. And Svetlana was going to hand Dan over to Finn to collect that bounty. She had even spiked his drink. Dan starts feeling drowsy. And Finn's people are on their way. Dan wakes up his family. Everyone finds out that Svetlana did this. But Svetlana now switches sides and tells them all, "You need to get out of here. Here, take my car." They all get in the car. Kyle has to drive. But this car is a manual. Jessica's mom is making him press the clutch while she shifts the gears herself. They escape from Finn's people, driving through the market. Dan is completely spiked. He's rambling nonsense. Kyle drives the car down a huge flight of stairs. Kyle closes his eyes tight and drives through an intersection at full speed. The next day, Dan sobers up. His plan is to take his family to some safe place where they can live a normal life. Dan can't keep his family with him because there's danger around him. Nina says, "No, Dad, we are stronger when we are together. Now, if they run from here, they'll have to change their identities and keep running from the police forever. Or if they go to the police, Finn will expose Dan's truth to everyone. After that, Dan will go to jail too. And everyone Dan ever wronged might still come after his family. So neither plan will work. They have to break into Finn's house and take down McCaffrey's encrypted server first." Dan's family is shocked to see his childhood home. Dan explains that right now, Finn has the most lethal assassins on his payroll. So security will be extremely tight. The best way in is the roof. Kyle says, "Dad, if you can't get this into the terminal, then I can wipe the mainframe and all the files." After that, Finn won't have any proof of Dan's past left. They'll also need some kind of distraction on the street, which Omar will handle. But if anything goes wrong, they'll have to leave Dan behind and run. Dan and Omar parkour their way toward the mansion's roof. They change the angles of the cameras. Dan encounters an assassin. Nina is recording all of this from below. Kyle copies and alters the recorded voice and responds to Finn on the walkie-talkie, so everything seems normal to Finn. Down below, Omar's friends show up and start protesting. Nina slips into the crowd. She leads them to Finn's house. They start protesting in the name of oil pollution. But then the police grab Nina, asking, "What are you doing?" So Omar smashes a car window. And the police grab him instead. But all of this does distract Finn. Dan sneaks into the mansion through a secret passage from his childhood. This is Dan's childhood room. But Finn shows up and holds him at gunpoint. Back in childhood, Dan had told Finn about this secret passage. Just as Finn is about to kill Dan, Vikram says, "We have a room for things like this." As Dan is being taken away, he tells Jessica to run. But Finn sees him doing this. He pulls out her body cam and destroys it. Jessica says, "Your dad was clear about what we had to do." But Kyle says, "Dad must have dropped the flash drive, as it's not moving. We can still save him if we get control of the main computer." Jessica says, "If anything goes wrong, you head to the US Embassy. And I am going in there to save your dad." Jessica climbs onto a rooftop. To move forward, she'll have to jump from this roof to the next one. But the distance is huge. Nina tries to stop her from doing this. But Jessica doesn't listen. She backs up, runs, and jumps. Meanwhile, Finn is asking Dan, who brings their entire family here? He's sent his assassins after them. Jessica reaches Dan's room from the roof. She also finds the dropped flash drive right there. Vikram takes them all to a dark room. But before Finn can shoot Dan, Vikram throws him down. Vikram is loyal to their dad no matter what, and there is no question as to which son he'd want Vikram to protect. In the meantime, Jessica plugs the flash drive into the main computer. Kyle gets access to the CCTVs and sees someone heading toward Jessica. Jessica goes and hides in a closet. But this assassin has a sword. She hears the sound of Jessica breathing from inside the closet. Jessica realizes hiding won't work. While trying to escape, she fights the assassin. But how can Jessica hold her own against an assassin? Meanwhile, down below, Dan knows every corner of this house. Using that knowledge, he starts taking on the assassins one by one. Upstairs, Jessica throws books at the assassin. She traps the sword in a book and throws it down. In hand-to-hand combat, Jessica gets the upper hand on the assassin. She hits her on the head with a face sculpture. But just then, an assassin appears in front of the kid's car. Kyle has to hack the main computer quickly. He uploads a virus, gets out of the car, and runs. They all reach a fair. But the assassin is right behind them. Back at the mansion, Finn pulls the flash drive out of his main computer. And right then, all of his bank accounts start getting wiped out. All the records are being deleted. Just then, Dan appears in front of Finn. Finn angrily grabs his gun and goes after him. But Dan grabs him and throws his gun away. The two of them crash through the glass and end up outside the mansion. Dan is saying, "Let it go, Finn. Dad's empire is gone." But Finn says, "Let's play," and runs. The two of them end up in a church. Both of them fight on top of the church bells. Meanwhile, Jessica also reaches the fair. Max calls out to his mom. But hearing his voice, the assassin comes toward them. Nina and Jessica throw the assassin away and tell the police themselves, "We're the bank robbers from England." Back at the church, Finn and Dan are playing hide and seek around the bells. Now Finn wants to kill Dan. He says, "I don't need Dad's empire. I rose from nothing once. I'll do it again." But Dan comes in front of Finn and beats him. Finn tries to fight back. But Dan ties him up with a rope and leaves him hanging in the church. When Dan comes out, his entire family is standing there in handcuffs. The police grab Dan too. But instead of being sad, they're happy. Everyone is loaded into the police van. They all wish each other Merry Christmas. The police take Finn away too. But just then, Omar shows up with his dad. Omar's dad is actually the Secretary General of Interpol. And Omar had tried to tell them about this many times, but Dan never listened to him. Jessica also steps out and tells Dan about her job offer. Dan is thrilled. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" 11 months later, they're now living in Ohio. Dan is talking to Omar on a video call. He's finally accepted him as part of the family. Max is now practicing parkour like Omar. Nina and Kyle have also come home for Thanksgiving. At the end, Dan goes to prison to visit Finn. He gives him a coat as a Thanksgiving gift. They both put on matching coats. The two of them start playing cards just like they used to in childhood. And with that, this story comes to an end. Let me know in the comments how you liked this explanation. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.